January 21st, 1968. Midnight is a rumor in the high Arctic. Out over the black water off northwest Greenland, the horizon glows the color of old ice and exhaust. A B-52G, call sign loaded with routine, drags 8 engines and a Cold War behind it, the belly carrying what no one will say aloud into a microphone. The crew flies the route they've flown so many times that the checklist has become a kind of prayer. Switch, verify, cross-check, copy. The air smells like hot insulation and coffee gone to coins. Everyone is awake because the airframe never lets you sleep. They are on a chrome dome mission, one of the airborne segments of an idea that sounded logical on paper and reckless anywhere else. Keep nuclear bombs aloft so that whatever the first minutes of war choose to do, the second minutes will not be empty. The plane circles a loop that takes it past Thule Air Base, an American outpost on Greenland's frozen edge, where radar dishes look over the curve of the world and eavesdrop on missile birth. It is the century's strangest choreography. New Mexico Sunshine designed the weapon. Kansas built the bomber. Greenland hosts the ear that pretends to be a wall, and men from a dozen towns wear the piece of sky that ties them together. In the cockpit, the pilot glances at gauges and sees what pilots always see, needles that want you to think in centimeters. The co-pilot repeats numbers that sounded sane on the ground and slightly absurd up here. The navigator draws a line, checks a fix, writes a time. The gunner keeps his own counsel. The electronic warfare officer listens to a world of ghosts, the radio man to a world of requests. A plane this large makes room for solitude, even when the crew sits elbow to elbow. You know each other's habits. How a man clears his throat when he's about to ask for a heading, how he taps the checklist when he needs to shut his brain up. But you live, each of you, in a small country shaped like your seat, somewhere in the aft section, a thing that should never meet heat meets heat. Theories about what touched what will multiply later, wiring, a cushion, a heater, a scrap of flammable where no flammable was planned. But on the plane itself, causality becomes immediate, the way pain is immediate. Someone smells it first, sweet at the edge, then sour, then the unmistakable smell of something plastic, discovering that it was never asked for permission. A call travels forward, smoke. It takes half a second to turn the word into action. The flight engineer throws switches with hands that know the layout better than they know their children's faces. Air changes course through ducts like a city's water being rerouted from a burst main. In the crew's throats, a new taste blooms: copper and fear. It is not panic. Panic is a performance for people who have time. This is calculation made with muscles. NTHE fire is not trained. It does not read the manual. It snakes invisibly behind panels where fingers cannot reach, and where extinguishers refuse to curl. The cabin's temperature climbs the way a lie climbs, quietly, then all at once. The pilot calls the base. Thule is ahead, the strip, a gray ribbon laid across white. The tower answers in a voice that is both a person and an institution. They hear calm. Calm is the product they sell. NTHEB-52 is heavy with fuel, heavy with everything that defines the era. Jettison is not a word you say casually when your cargo can end headlines. So they try to nurse a wounded body toward a runway few humans ever see. Outside, the wind does what it always does at this latitude. Makes decisions for men and dares them to object. The engines howl like a stadium empty of people. The nose pitches to make distance and hope into synonyms. In the main cabin, flames show themselves. The crew turns into the only fire brigade available at 30,000 feet. Masks on, gloves on, extinguishers discharged until they're light as toys. Smoke stays. It grows smart. It hides in the places fire loves. Wire bundles, insulation, the delta between what engineers designed and what years of maintenance have turned the machine into. The B-52 becomes a barn with a bad secret in its rafters. The crew feels it the way you feel a house go wrong, through your feet first, then your lungs, then your brain. NTHE commander makes a decision that was always going to be asked of him. He turns toward Thule, with a straight line in his head. The radar on the ground sweeps and catches the metal flicker of a plane and the odd oily smear that follows fire in cold air. On base, a bell that is a klaxon that is a sentence rings. People leave coffee. People run. NTHE runway lights burn steady in the winter half-night. The wind decides to be unhelpful. The B-52 knows this wind and hates it. The crew fights two enemies, the one outside that pushes and the one inside that chews. The cabin fills enough that eyes water and then stop, which is worse. Fire throws light where you don't need it. Smoke lays dark where you do. Instruments become suggestions. Training becomes the only furniture that doesn't move. NTHE commander orders a descent he wishes were slower. He knows altitude is time and time is choice. He knows both are being stolen. In the back, a shout becomes a cough, becomes a number on an oxygen gauge that should not be this low. Masks hiss like small animals. The plane dips its shoulder to line up with the runway. The runway is long, but so is the list of things that can happen in the seconds before rubber meets it. NTHE, fire wins the first fight. It chews through wiring, finds air to eat, gets behind panels arranged by an engineer who never imagined this particular snake. The cockpit loses more than comfort. It loses confidence in a handful of systems that are supposed to be boring. Boring is a religion at altitude. Boring means you get to live long enough to be bored tomorrow. Boring is leaving the plane the same shape as the drawings. The plane is no longer that shape. NTHE, order to bail out, is the kind of order that changes a person's life even when the parachute works exactly as designed. No one wants to leave a plane to its own decisions when the plane carries what this one carries. But there are numbers that don't care about wishes. The commander barks what he needs to bark. Men who have been practicing falling for years do the thing they have practiced. Hatches become holes, holes become air. Air becomes a slap that argues with your lungs before the parachute picks a fight with the wind. Below them, the oldest sea in the world waits. Between them and the sea, a geometry of gray ice and black water rolls its dice. On the base, the sky brightens not with dawn, but with the kind of glow men describe quickly when they're told to write it down later. A fireball is a proverb made of chemistry. It rises and the air behaves like a crowd. First still, then leaning in, then trying to get away from what it came to see. The bomber comes apart with the logic of physics and the chaos of accident. Metal that once obeyed bolts becomes leaf. Fuel that once counted on pumps becomes a river on fire, across ice and into water. The cargo inside the belly meets a world it was never designed to meet. Ice, wind, brine, gravity, and the accountants of chance. Thule's runway fills with men in parkas that make them look like the puffed-up icons on safety cards. Trucks move in a choreography that has been drawn on a board so many times that even the vehicles could drive themselves. Ambulances, fire rigs, security that secures more than perimeter. The air temperature that would be murderous to a tourist is just a condition here. People's faces go raw quickly, then stop complaining. Snow catches light like paper. The tower tries to count chutes. A voice says a number, and another voice tries to put a name to each. Some land on ice that holds. Some land on ice that pretends, then breaks. One lands in water that does not make room. Rescue crews move because seconds have mass. It is still a military place, but a civilian world is pressed against it at all times. Thule exists at the mouth of a trick question. Who owns what when a country puts its base in another country's frozen parish? Greenland belongs to Denmark. The United States has a lease signed in a different decade with a different gravity. The lease says what leases say, what you may not, and what we will pretend we agree not to say aloud. Denmark's politics carry a sentence everyone knows, even if they don't say it in English: no nukes on Greenland. But The Cold War's grammar finds the passive voice useful. Weapons that exist without being said to exist can travel through spaces where they are not supposed to exist. This is one of those nights when grammar meets fire. NTHE word that travels across telephones and wakes people in different time zones is one the Air Force keeps in a glass case with a hammer. Broken arrow. It does not mean anyone launched anything. It means a weapon has become a problem without becoming a war. The word is designed to be specific enough to mobilize and vague enough to quiet microphones. It works and does not work. Radios organize themselves into nets. Headquarters becomes plural. A colonel's voice from Europe has the texture of midnight over there. A captain in Greenland speaks faster because cold makes you speak like a stenographer. The Pentagon grows more eyes and ears by the minute. In Copenhagen, pages flip hard enough to make wind. On the ice near the crash, the light fails to choose whether it is day or night. Searchlights draw cones. The flame throws its own geometry. Somewhere under those cones and that flame are pieces that were designed to be coy when angered or injured. The bombs were not designed to explode when shaken like bottles. They are complicated creatures built to make sure that even stupid luck must ask permission. But a fire that eats from the inside can present a puzzle that even good design did not consider. Crew safing devices, interlocks, barriers that ask for multiple agreements before anything bright happens. These are all there. They are doing their work. No one wants to be the person who has to trust them with his eyes. NTHE first hours belong to rescue. Parachutes star the ice like flags in a country that refuses to be flat. Men are pulled from water whose language is shock, from ice that behaves long enough to be a litter, from wind that cannot decide whether to help a human or move them. Some crews do not come home. The ones who do are put into a building that smells like wool and disinfectant and coffee whose bite was earned the hard way. Medics watch fingers and noses and ears for that first sign they learn in school and only respect once they've seen it. White, that means black is coming. They thaw what they can thaw. They mark what they cannot. They say, "You'll be all right," and mean it, because meaning it helps. Then the second hours claim the scene. This is the part of a night like this that will never be a movie because it looks like men walking slowly and writing things down. The fire department does what it can with what it has. Fuel fires are born to learn and to relearn. Foam meets flame. Flame argues. Cold air carries heat away so efficiently that it becomes a collaborator. The crash sprawls across ice and into the open water. The little pans of sea between the big plates of ice boil the way soup does when you ask too much of a burner. The cargo inside the bomber, now a family of uncooperative parts, spreads its problem across a map that keeps moving. Commanders who woke up in beds now stand in parkas and draw boxes in the air, then boxes on paper, then boxes in people's heads. This is the working vocabulary. Zone hot, zone warm, zone cold. This is the scrub list. Who goes in? Who stays out? Who carries? Who counts? Who watches the watchers? A word rises that will be an address for months. Cleanup. Another follows it. That is what cleanup means when the thing you spilled is not oil or milk. Decontamination. It is a complicated idea that looks simple when done well. It is the art of telling dust where to live and then carrying it there without letting it marry the wind. NTHE wind, insulted by human plans, moves. Snow becomes the medium that betrays your footprints and then hides evidence at the same time. Every person walking in the hot zone becomes a carrier pigeon that you wish carried nothing. So the crews dress themselves in a way that makes movement into a negotiation. Goggles fog and lie. Masks gag and tell the truth. Gloves make fingers stupid and spare them. Men who could take apart machines with their eyes closed now learn to tie new knots wearing hands with mittens. And into this awkward choreography step the Greenlandic workers whose lives are tied to this place in a way no one inside a uniform can be tied. They were born to this latitude and will be buried in it. They bring sleds and patience and the ability to hold a tool in a glove that you cannot buy in a catalog. You hear two languages on the ice, and then a third, the language of numbers. Numbers that live on handheld meters, the kind with needles that judder and then pick a place to rest. Numbers that live on clipboards where a man writes quietly because shouting numbers at a wind is an invitation to superstition. Numbers that live in heads after a while, where the needle's twitch becomes a part of your peripheral vision even when the meter is not there. If you are lucky and trained, the numbers mean what they're supposed to mean. If you are less lucky or less trained, the numbers mean fear. The job of those in charge is to make the first case dominate the second. NTHE World, outside the ice, takes notice. Newsrooms learn new names. Thule, Pitufik, a base you can only find if you already know where it is. Wire services compete to make the Arctic sound like a location and not a concept. Politicians are asked to square two truths live on air. Denmark forbids nuclear weapons on its soil. An American bomber carrying such weapons crashed very near to soil that both sides have spent years agreeing is a special case. The answers are polite noises wrapped around temporary shelters made of words like arrangement and understandings. The reporters write those words down and then call a second source in the hope of getting one that hurts more. The second source often knows less. The story grows arms. Inside the perimeter, none of that noise counts because snow falls exactly the same on argument and agreement. People pick up fragments that look, to a lay eye, like airplane. They bag them, they label them, they carry them to places designed in an hour and named for the sake of signs. They come back when told, and when told, they do not. There is a rhythm to this work that no one teaches. It comes from the materials. It says, unload this first, let this wait, avoid that, go around here, step there, absolutely do not step there, because a man stepped there a minute ago and learned a lesson we do not need to repeat. The lesson is written on a sign by noon. By evening, the sign is part of the landscape. You cannot tell an Arctic story without telling the story of light. The hours are wrong here. The sun is an unreliable partner that takes long coffee breaks and leaves you in blue for longer than seems fair. In that blue, the searchers learn what the ocean has done with the bomber's cargo. Some of it, betrayed by the way, metal, ignores camouflage. Some of it disguised as islands that weren't there yesterday. Some of it sunk in places that declare, not today. Teams mark those places because the next days will ask them to come back with tools that make the sea keep a promise. The sea laughs but respects the paperwork. There is a moment, sometime on the second day, when everyone who counts themselves necessary in the triangle of decisions, base command, specialists, the people from far away who arrived with briefcases, and the mandate to make small choices now in order to prevent big choices later, stand around a table and pretend the table is the land. They trace lines with gloved fingers. They argue in voices that do not rise, because breath makes clouds that cover maps. They begin to formalize what will be the name you will find in the archives later if you're the sort of person who looks. A project name for a cleanup that would become legend in the kind of community that never wants to be legendary. They will call it something cold and tidy that fits on a form. At the edges of that tidy name, men will thaw and refreeze 1,000 times until spring comes in the heart and the calendar at the same time. News photographs cannot resist the image of a man in white, walking across white, carrying a package labeled with symbols that we invented to terrify ourselves into doing the right thing. They will show those images, and the world will nod, and the world will not smell the insulation burn or the way cold makes metal smell like pennies. They will not hear the way wind eats words, so that you have to stand too close to say, "Hand me that." They will not feel how a meter suddenly matters more than any rank you can wear on a parka. They will not learn the names the crews give to each little area because humor becomes a boundary line. Call a patch of ice the office enough times, and your brain will agree to treat it like a place where you can do work instead of a place where your face can get the wrong kind of quiet. In Copenhagen, there are meetings that make heat without warmth. In Washington, There are meetings that mistake heat for progress. In both places, there are people who lay the minutes next to each other and watch secrets leak through commas. The public will be told as much truth as the calendar can afford. Later, more will be told because time makes generals braver and politicians less fluent in denial. But there is a limit. There is always a limit. You can hear it in the phrase, "sources differ." You can see it in the way a clerk's hand hesitates over a black marker, then commits, and a line in a report turns from a sentence into a stripe. On the ice, the work persists in its holy tedium. A line of Greenlanders pulling sledges that look ancient and are, and men in white suits that look modern and are, and both groups doing the same thing, moving weight from where it should not be toward where it will bother fewer people. Helicopters do the noisy part. Forklifts do the rude part. Hands do the part that later keeps you from thinking you did nothing. A coffee thermos circles a group and ends up empty at exactly the right second to make another pot necessary, which means someone goes inside and someone else goes outside, and the flow of the day continues without the need for a man with a whistle. A rumor is born that will outlive the event. It says one of the bomb components is missing. It says the ice kept it. It says the sea learned a new secret. It says men in suits stood around a hole in the ice and made a decision that could not be written down. Like most rumors, it includes a handful of true nouns and a bouquet of verb tenses that let everyone pretend to be brave. The people on the ice do not have time for rumor. The people off the ice will meet at parties years later and ask each other whether the rumor was true. Each will find in the other's hesitation exactly the answer they came to hear. What is certain is this: the plane burned. It fell. 4 weapons were aboard. None exploded as designed. Material that no one wants outside its container left its container. A base and a village, and the men who served both, were asked to do a job that could only be measured in patience. The rest is a spectrum between precise and plausible. The cleanup will follow that spectrum the way a skier follows a ridgeline, staying just under the summit because the cornice might slide. NTHE first week is a month long. The second week is 2 days. By the third, the machine has found its crank. You can stand at a certain corner of a certain building and know that at a certain minute a certain truck will pass. You can step into a warmed room where the door closers are the most generous invention in history and feel your nose remember what air is supposed to do. You can hear laughter that does not mean joy but does mean health. You can see, in the way the trash is handled, that a system has become a habit. And habits are how you survive any weather. NTHAT is where we leave the first part of the story. A runway that wears tire rubber like scars, a stretch of ice that has learned new vocabulary, a room with a map that keeps being wrong and then made right enough for tomorrow, and a base that has discovered what it means to host an accident and a truth at the same time. The men who jumped walk with blankets around their shoulders, blinking at lights that were installed for other people's landings. The men who stayed carry meters that tick and refuse to be dramatic. The wind practices its only song. The world beyond the perimeter clears its throat to ask questions it will not know how to hear the answers to. NTHE night that began with the smell of something that shouldn't burn has become a morning where everything smells a little bit like the inside of a battery. The work does not end because morning shows up. It only learns to use the light. NWE will pick up from here. How the cleanup got its name, how a village became a workforce, how a frozen shore hosted a factory for turning fear into barrels and barrels into departures, and how, long after the headlines sat down, the ice kept a few sentences no one could entirely finish. NNTHE, ice kept a few sentences no one could entirely finish. That was the mood in the briefings the next morning. Men in parkas and wool caps, cheeks roughened by wind, standing around a plywood table while a pencil tapped a map that had already grown soft at the creases. The first order of the new day was naming the work. Names matter in emergencies. They put handles on weight. The one chosen fit the place and the task at once. Crested ice. 2 words that sounded like a postcard, and, to the people in that room, like a factory schedule. Crested ice began with lanes. The crash site sprawled across sea ice and open water like a spill that kept changing its mind. So they drew order onto it, the way a surveyor makes a town out of tents and footpaths. Grid squares were lettered, then numbered. Each square got a chief and a log. The chief signed for men, for tools, for meters, for the kind of knowledge you only keep if you promissory, noted to paper the same hour you earn it. The log kept the memory no one could be asked to carry alone, and a line of sledges became a supply chain. The Greenlandic workers, men who had grown up in weather that teaches you respect before you have a name for it, pulled by dog and by hand, following routes their eyes could see even when the wind was erasing them. They were efficient where the Americans were strong, patient where the Americans were loud, fierce exactly where the Americans were careful. None of that was in the memos. It was in the way the day proceeded without collapsing. You could tell who had been assigned to hot work by the sound they made when they came back inside. The cold turned zippers into musical instruments. The stiff, sweet clatter of metal teeth was as much a status symbol as any badge. They would stamp the snow from their boots, the snow that never entirely forgives you for asking it to leave, and they would hold their hands under forced air vents like supplicants begging a different god than yesterday's. A pot of coffee lived on a stove whose pilot light had learned a loyalty the Air Force admired more than anything with wings. NTHE plan itself was simple enough to teach at a blackboard and complicated enough to break you if you tried to do it too quickly. First, find. Second, measure. Third, cut. Fourth, package. Fifth, move. Sixth, measure again, because the thing about dust, the dangerous kind, the kind that makes headlines a decade after everyone forgets which building held the meetings, is that it loves to ride. It will steal a lift on a sleeve. It will ask a breeze to marry it. It will pretend to be snow if that gets it invited places. Crews dress themselves in layers of denial. Suits, gloves, boots, masks, all engineered to rob dust of its charm. Someone had the idea, a good one, to melt the problem into barrels rather than shovel it into them. Melters arrived. Steel boxes with burners that turned snow and ice into water, and water into proof that you had not lost your mind. The dirty melt went through filters. The filters learned new swear words. Barrels lined up to be fed, each with a number stenciled in block letters, each with a lid that would carry a history out of Greenland and into a future where someone would have to store it and point at it and say, "That one." Thule 68. A man with a clipboard became the keeper of a litany, drum numbers and grid squares, and the minutes when this much became that much, when the solid became a liquid and then returned to solid in a form a ship would consent to carry. Ships mattered in every conversation. Winter was a dictator here, but water and direct routes were its legislature. Everything you scraped and cut and melted and poured had to leave before the seasonal softening turned the worksite into a poem of slush. Under every briefing was a calendar, and under the calendar was a tide table, and under the tide table was the nervous truth of the Arctic. It answers to no plan but its own. The port schedule was a prayer disguised as logistics. There were, as there always are, two parallel operations. The one you could see, men with poles and saws, men with meters and bags, men with sledges and radios, helicopters scissoring low under a ceiling that moved whenever it wanted to. And the one you could not see, paper. Paper in triplicate, paper that traveled by pouch, by briefcase, by the guilt-ridden hand of a man who knew he was about to make someone else's day harder. Paper that would one day be bound in a report with a title that sounded like a bowling league and a conclusion that sounded like a treaty. Paper was the scaffolding you could build around a problem you could not pick up with bare hands. Danish officials arrived with questions that were polite and sharp at the same time. They wore hats that looked sensible in wind and expressions that said they could do arithmetic in more than one currency. The first day's meeting started with coffee and ended with vocabulary. Broken arrow. Did this mean what it sounded like? No nuclear detonation, the Americans said, emphasizing the last two words the way a man emphasizes, "I didn't do it, I only carried it." But there is dispersal, the Danes asked. The Americans used the careful voice you use around someone else's living room. Yes, dispersal, in the sense that fire took things apart the way fire does. And the bombs. What state were the bombs in? The Americans arranged their nouns like furniture, components, assemblies, materials. Words that looked nothing like the words the world used when it wanted to be frightened. And outside the conference room, a forklift put its forks into a crate that weighed too much for fear. A sergeant walked next to it, one hand on the wood, as if he were walking a large dog that might lunge. The forklift beeped in a rhythm that offended the wind, which refused to get out of the way. Men in white suits tugged at their hoods with the exasperation of astronauts who couldn't scratch an itch. NTHE rumor that one component had sunk into water too deep for winter had a way of showing up exactly when a day had gone well. It would be there in the bunk room like an extra pillow. It would travel down chow lines like salt. It would stand next to the doorway of the thaw room like a friend you hope not to see. Some shrugged it off. Some did not. Divers looked over the edge of the ice at a dark that seemed to have mass. In the spring, the planners said, "We'll bring machines." And they meant submersibles and sonar and a vocabulary that made the sea reluctantly confess. Before that, crews put flags down to mark the spots where the needles had twitched, and the men with the richest intuition had nodded. If the sea meant to keep a secret, it would have to work for it. And at the periphery of the hot work were small, business-like miracles that kept the day from fraying. Boots drying on wooden pegs in a pattern you could set your watch by. Gloves thawed and rotated like loaves in an oven. The indispensable woman at the field kitchen learning which crews needed soup dumped into them as if they were machines, and which needed to be listened to about a sister back home whose letters smelled somehow, like lilacs even here. A Danish liaison officer discovered that the fastest way to diffuse a misunderstanding about who could walk where was to place a thermos in the middle of a map and pour for both sides until the steam made a truce. A Greenlandic foreman taught an American major how to tie a line in gloves without using teeth. The major pretended not to be astonished and then practiced it until the muscle learned the knot. Better than the memory, N meters ruled. A man could be a colonel, but if his needle said no go, he stayed behind the line like anyone else. The needle wasn't God, but it had a better bedside manner. You learned to listen for its small tantrums, to see out of the corner of your eye when it wanted to tell you that what looked like ordinary snow was a chapter you didn't want to open with your boots. A chalkboard mounted to the side of a Quonset hut recorded the day's limits. The numbers changed like exchange rates. Advice traveled by pencil as much as by mouth. The wind found a way into everything. It untied 2 quick knots. It filed your patience down to the grain. It moved signs, then buried them, then set them free again, the way a child plays with a toy without intending to break it and breaks it anyway. It lifted the plastic skirts of the melters and made them flap like skirts. It tried to steal clipboards. It always won against cigarettes. It turned men into silhouettes in a flicker, the way you look up from a task and see only the shape of someone against the pale sky and know, without seeing a face, who it is by the way the coat falls and the gate argues with the snow. An airplane from somewhere south and warmer landed and disembarked a different kind of cargo. Specialists whose job titles made sense in Washington and had to be translated on the ice. They unfurled diagrams like magicians, scarves. They spoke about isotope ratios and particle sizes, about volatile fractions and insolubles, about leachates and fixatives, and the best way to keep a barrel from persuading a floor to remember it forever. The crews listened politely, asked short questions, and then went back outside to do the version of those nouns that fit into a glove. After the lecture, one of the specialists stood alone by a window in the chow hall and watched a line of sledges take a slow curve to keep the dogs from slipping. He wrote in his notebook, not about the lecture he had just given, but about the way a driver patted the neck of the lead dog when the curve was done. The note saved him from thinking his job was the only job. In Copenhagen, a headline decided to be larger than usual. The font shouted what the diplomats whispered. Parliament wanted answers. In Danish, please. The ministry wanted assurances that sounded like statements. The Americans wanted the conversation to occur inside the kind of sentence that does not have a subject. People in suits agreed to hold a joint press conference in which the pronouns would be carefully rationed. "We are working together," they would say. "Safety is the priority," they would swear. "The incident is under control," they would add, defining control as a moving target none of the reporters could see from the seats they had been allotted. The cameras recorded blocks of ice being lifted into trucks and men in masks whose eyes looked like numbers. The pictures arrived in living rooms that had never been this cold and gave the story an audience who would remember the images long after they forgot the nouns. Crested ice developed a rhythm: wake, brief, work, thaw, count, work, eat, work, skate, sleep, skate. Because sometimes the only mischief the day allowed was the kind you did with patched skates on a patch of safe ice behind a building. You could tell how tired a man was by how many laps he took before he admitted he was laughing. The base chaplain began ending his brief evening service with the same 3 sentences. Be careful with your hands. Be patient with your eyes. Be generous with your silence. Men who never went to services found excuses to wander by the door and catch those sentences anyway. In Spring kept its appointment in Greenland with the sort of punctuality you distrust until it happens. The light came back as if it had only been in the other room. The edge of the ice, out there where the open water waited, loosened like a shirt collar after a long day. That changed everything. It meant the timeline became a deadline for real. It meant the sea wanted what the ice had been hoarding. It meant the underwater phase would begin earlier than looked comfortable on charts. NTHE engineers from the Navy arrived with crates and smiles that said they trusted their machines more than the weather and trusted the weather exactly as much as their machines. Sonar talk moved into the briefings. Electrons replaced dogs for an hour each morning. The divers trained above water in every way you can train without drowning, and then calmly reminded everyone that the sea would write the real syllabus. When the first ROV slid under the edge and its camera sent back a picture of a world that looked like birth and ruin at the same time, the room applauded without remembering to. The pictures were grainy, green, convincing. The sonar printed, slowly, a shape that might be what some people were hoping it wasn't. The team lead wrote 2 reports, one for action, one for history. The action report said, investigate here, here, and here. The history one said, sources differ on whether what was seen was what it might have been. What they did retrieve was not dramatic in photographs. Racks, pieces that only specialists would recognize as handles for a larger idea. Twisted tubing that had once introduced certainty to fuel and had been introduced to fire instead. The color of the metal had changed in ways the metallurgists found exciting and the rest of the world found alarming. Each recovery triggered the same choreography. Boat to shore, meter to piece, tag to bag, note to clipboard, clipboard to office, office to radio, radio to a voice hundreds of miles away that had to translate emotion into jargon before it could say good job. Inside the perimeter, the rumor about the missing part became folklore rather than news. Men told it to the newly arrived the way you tell a ghost story you don't believe, but also don't not believe. The Americans smiled with their teeth. The Danes smiled with their eyes. The Greenlanders said nothing, which is how you behave when the sea is in the story. If it wants to keep something, it keeps it. And if it wants to give it back, it gives it back on a Tuesday when you are thinking about soup. End barrels accumulated in neat ranks, like soldiers no one would salute, but everyone would obey. The stencils multiplied, numbers, destinations, warnings that were at once universal and ridiculously specific. Someone started a tally on a chalkboard, 1 tick for every drum loaded onto a flatbed for the trip to the ship. The board filled in a pleasingly regular way, but the last few lines stalled, as last few lines always do. A blizzard erased a week. A winch decided to speak only in its own dialect and had to be persuaded with a hammer. A crane operator got sick, and for a day, the whole operation learned exactly how many people on base could lift 3 tons gently with their wrists and eyes. NTHE health teams worked on their own slow scale. They drew blood, they collected samples in cups men resented, and then, months later, were grateful had been collected. They logged who had been where and for how long, knowing that 10 years hence those lines would become arguments in offices far from any snow. They recorded symptoms that could have been caused by cold, by worry, by anything, knowing that paperwork does not care about ambiguity, but still demanding it be written down. They were professional faces you remember later when you need an anchor and a name. They forgot no one. The roster mattered more than rank. In Denmark, the scandal that would later earn its own nickname, predictable, almost playful in the way democratic scandals arrange their syllables, began to take shape. Old agreements were taken out of drawers and held up to light. The words looked different against a new sky. Did we know? When did we know that we knew? Do words like overflight and storage and deterrence walk the same road, or only cross each other at night? Testimony found microphones. People who had been careful found themselves quoted as if care were guilt. No nukes on Greenland, the policy said, and the public learned, without needing or wanting the details, how the Cold War filled the space between policy and practice with exceptions, arrangements, and understandings. The men on the ice had the cleanest job of all. Move the barrels. Everyone else had the dirty job. Move the blame. NBY, late spring. Crested ice had earned the second syllable of its name the hard way. The crust softened. The grid squares had to be redrawn in pencil instead of pen. Vehicles that had been as confident as cows began to tiptoe like cats. Milters groaned under loads that had turned slushy with the kind of defiance you only get from water. Sledges squeaked. Dogs looked back at their drivers with expressions that said, "This is on you." The crews adjusted with the sort of competence that looks like luck to the untrained eye. They shifted weight. They smoothed paths with shovels and jokes. They kept a pace you could maintain without heroics, because heroics belong in books and hospitals, not in logistics. The day the last drum left the site for the ship was not a victory parade. It was a counted breath. A forklift backed, beeped, stopped, and a man in a white suit put both gloved hands on the drum, the way you put hands on the shoulder of someone who is about to set out on a long trip. The flatbed took the weight, and the driver, who had grown so used to driving carefully that it had changed his posture, eased forward and made a turn so precise you could have measured it with a protractor. On the chalkboard, the final tick looked too small to mean anything, and yet it meant the ship could sail. They washed the machines as if they were horses. They washed the boots until leather showed through a month's worth of stubborn. They washed the buildings like they were boats, and the season were turning. They washed the inside of the melters until they shone with a cleanliness that only steel can achieve, which is to say, a plausible one. They washed the sledges because it felt right, even though everyone knew wood and rope are older than worry. They washed their hands until their hands remembered what skin felt like under a glove. May, summer fog moved in as if to reward them with privacy. The fog wrapped the base in a gray silence and gave the site the look of a memory trying to be dignified. It was, briefly, almost warm. Men found themselves standing outside without hats and felt both brave and stupid. Someone took a photograph of the runway with a single gull crossing it at a dignified height, and the photograph made it all the way to a wall in an office in the Pentagon, where a general would eat lunch under it and stare at the gull and imagine what the bird thought of deterrence. NTHE ship cast off with less fuss than anyone expected. The port crew worked the lines like this was any other cargo, because to the port crew it was weight and terms, moisture and schedule. The captain promised weather and delivered it. The drums, stenciled and documented, left the latitude that had complicated them and headed toward a latitude that would contain them in concrete and fences and the unglamorous rituals of long storage. On deck, a petty officer walked the rows the way a shepherd walks a flock in a storybook. He counted, because counting is a profession. And after the ship, the site looked naked. The cones were still there, the flags that had become part of the horizon were there, the signs that had learned to bend without snapping were there. But without the work, they looked like props from a play that had closed. In that nakedness, small truths revealed themselves. The ice had healed in places the way skin does, imperfectly but determinedly. Seals moved in the open water with the same impulses their grandparents had. The sky, relieved of searchlights, remembered its relationship to blue. Crested ice did not end with the ship. It ended with a memo, and then another, and then a ritual, the all-hands brief where the commander stood on a crate, took his hat off because wind no longer made that a bad idea, and thanked people in an order that meant more to the people than the words did. He said the right names. He said Greenlandic names careful as China. He said Danish names like a guest who has learned how to pronounce the vowels. He said American names like an inventory he was proud to own. He said we did the work, and the men and women who had done it allowed themselves a 3-second permission to believe that sentence before they returned to their usual skepticism. Later, there were ceremonies in capitals in which documents were exchanged by hands that had never been cold for longer than a brisk walk. There were health studies whose drafts lived in file drawers, then in the hands of lawyers, then in the pages of papers that compared numbers in a font more elegant than any chalkboard. Some of those numbers comforted, some did not. Some people were paid, some people were not. The ice had its own account book, and it did not accept dollars or kroner. And always, there was that unfinished sentence the sea kept. Divers returned in kinder weather with better machines. They found things that taught them humility and things that taught them stamina. And they wrote reports that ended with the same clever phrases: likely, unlikely, consistent with, inconsistent with, further work recommended when conditions permit. Conditions are polite when you are not in Greenland. In Greenland, conditions are a person you marry, knowing full well one of you will always win. In years past, the base remained. Planes came and went, fewer now, heavier with math and lighter with cargo. The radar dishes looked at the world the way an old shepherd looks at a flock that has learned to behave, but might not. Crews rotated, and the story became a briefing slide, and then a single bullet, and then a soft murmur in the back of a classroom. Thule, 68. The young men who heard it did not yet have the muscle memory of stepping off a tracked vehicle into air that bit all the way through. They would, someday, somewhere, in a different weather, pick up something heavy that had once been an emergency and move it toward a fence line. And the man teaching them would not say Thule again, because too many names make the mind dull. He would say only, do it like this, and they would. One autumn, a retired officer found himself in a small museum in Denmark with a glass case that held a pair of gloves and a photograph of a sled that could have been any sled. The caption was tidy. The words were careful. The officer stared at the gloves for a long time because gloves are not metaphors. They either fit your hand or they don't. He remembered the way the wind had pushed his breath back into his face when he had tried to shout directions on a day the map had pulled a trick. He remembered the taste of coffee that had been reheated 3 times. He remembered the way a Greenlandic worker had nodded once. Not approval, not contempt, just the kind of nod you give a man who is learning the right slowness. He left the museum grateful that the glass existed and mildly annoyed at the choice of photograph. He would have picked a different one. The forklift beeping while a snowflake landed on the driver's eyebrow and refused to melt. NTHE last official act of crested ice, on paper at least, was a letter from one agency to another that used the sort of language only love letters and bureaucracy share. We acknowledge receipt. We accept the transfer. We remain responsible. We understand the conditions. We have read the fine print. It was a small victory for commas. It was a larger victory for the proposition that mistakes can be handled, that accidents can be met with rituals that do not make things worse. In Greenland, the accident remained a local landmark without coordinates, like a story your grandfather tells 3 different ways depending on which chair he chooses that night. The sled dogs did not care, but their owners did. The base clinics kept their drawers labeled more carefully than they might have otherwise. The chaplain changed 2 sentences in his sermon years later without mentioning why. He stopped saying be generous with your silence and started saying be generous with each other. And then, because this is how the world keeps its head, the ordinary returned. That is not to say the place forgot. The ice does not forget, it compresses. What had been hot became the kind of cold that holds its tongue. The people who had been there went on to be people in other places. They taught their hands to other tools. They learned new winds that were less honest than Greenland's. Some of them never again liked the taste of coffee if it wasn't half burned. Some developed a habit of counting doors in a room as soon as they walked in. Some found themselves tapping the corners of their desks with a fingernail before they began a task, as if returning to a grid square. If you ask for a moral, you will get an argument. If you ask for a lesson, you will get several, some of them contradictory. One that satisfies at least a few people is this: a system that can hurt you must also be able to clean up after itself. Not perfectly. Nothing about ice and fire and machines and people is perfect, but adequately, with decency, with names and numbers and a stubborn refusal to turn a rumor into a plan. Another lesson is simpler and harder. When cold metal meets human hands in a wind that has opinions, the hands must win because they have pencils. We end where the work ended, not with a grand closing, but with a quiet one. A watch officer, years later, fills out a routine log at Thule under a light that hums, and his pen pauses for a beat when he writes the date. He doesn't know why. Somewhere down the hall, a door opens and lets in a blade of air that smells like the sea that took and gave. Outside, the dishes turn the same way they have always turned, listening to an edge of sky no one trusts entirely. And far from here, on a shelf that hums faintly because buildings hum, sit rows of drums labeled in block letters. They are uninteresting. They are accounted for. They are the proof that a bad night learned how to become a finished job. NTHE ice, if it could speak, would likely say nothing. It would simply hold the imprint of boots and sled runners for as long as boots and sled runners deserve to be remembered. Then let wind do what wind does best: edit. But if you stand beside that shore on a quiet day in a kinder season and look out toward where the dark water begins, you can almost hear the shape of a sentence in the chop. It sounds like work. It sounds like patience. It sounds like a place that survived a fire nobody invited, because thousands of decisions were made by people who had the nerve to be ordinary on the exact day the world demanded it. NNTHAT was the sentence people reached for when they tried to explain why the fire didn't become a legend of loss. The plane fell, the bombs broke without blooming, and a base built for radar became, for a season, a factory that made safety out of mess. And then, because someone has to close the book, men and women began to turn the last pages. NTHE last pages never look like the first. The first are uniforms and alarms and names everyone knows how to pronounce. The last are lab coats, clipboards, and nouns that don't fit into parades. A small office near the runway became the place where numbers took their coats off. Radiological samples that had traveled inside coolers like organs were unpacked, logged, divided, labeled, escorted to planes bound for labs whose windows looked out at parking lots instead of glaciers. Measurements became tables, tables became charts, charts became the sentences bureaucracies trust, within expected range, elevated but declining, recommend continued monitoring. Each sentence had a footnote. Each footnote had a date. Each date felt like a promise that this work would be remembered by people who had never tasted air that froze in your nose. NTHE, people who had carried shovels put their shovels away. They watched their hands for signs their hands were telling them something. Most of the time, the hands said nothing. Sometimes they said stiffness, or a tremor that could be cold or could be age. Medics filled out forms and filed them in drawers where the metal held its own kind of winter. Months later, letters arrived. Your samples show this. Your exposure totals that. We recommend checkups every so often. Here is a phone number you can call. The letterhead was impersonal by design. It gave the news without a grimace. For some, that felt like mercy. Nat Thule, crews dismantled what the season had built. Flags came down. Signs that had learned every curse word in 2 languages were stacked in a corner of a shed that smelled of oil and wet rope. The melters were disassembled, bolted to skids, and sent away to a climate that would bore them. The chalkboard was erased, leaving ghost numbers you could still read if you knew where to squint. A forklift operator who had spent 3 months thinking in inches walked out to the edge of the runway and stood there with his hands in his pockets, just because he could. A pair of Greenlandic workers took their sleds out without cargo and let the dogs run until the dogs laughed. That's the only word for the sound. And in Copenhagen, the tone changed. Politics is a weather of its own, and the front that followed Thule was full of thunder disguised as questions. What had been promised? What had been allowed? What had been quietly practiced? Because the world had found a way to live with contradictions that looked tidy from far away. The nuclear-free policy for Greenland, written in ink, met the airborne reality of a program designed to ensure nobody was tempted to try the unthinkable by keeping planes with very thinkable cargo in the sky. Laws stared at logistics. Logistics stared back. Committees called people to testify who had done their best work in places where the wind erased footsteps. The hearings were careful and heated, a combination only democracies can manage without choking. For the people who had worked the ice, the hearings were both too loud and too far away. They were proud of the barrels, the grids, the way a needle could veto a kernel. They were less sure what to feel about agreements drafted years earlier in rooms without frost. Some thought the argument was healthy. Sunlight is a disinfectant you can use without a mask. Some thought it was naive. Deterrence has always been a story told in sentences that bend. Most simply went back to work, because bases do not empty themselves, and you cannot fly a radar. NA calendar flips whether you pay attention or not. Summer became autumn. The aurora returned with its green handwriting. On a night when the wind had finally tired of shouting, someone in a parka put a hand on a dish's support column and felt the hum come through the metal like a sympathetic heartbeat. Radios murmured the names of weather patterns in voices that sounded older than the men speaking. A captain ran his finger down a maintenance list and thought about hot coffee instead of cold facts for exactly 7 seconds and then returned to the list. The Arctic forgives no daydream longer than that. The base, once again, was what it had been built to be, a set of eyes at the top of the world. N.E. elsewhere. Consequences. The program that kept bombers airborne like clocks learned from the way the sky had punished complacency. Flying with live weapons over allies and oceans began to look less like prudence and more like tempting fate. The solution was boring in the courageous way that saves lives. Scale back, then end the practice entirely. Standby grew roots in concrete instead of seeking them in clouds. Pilots still trained. Crews still rehearsed, but the world's most dangerous cargo spent more hours attached to ground that knew its name. In the United States, memos turned into orders with that peculiar American mixture of formality and frustrated common sense. Safety devices got attention that bordered on romance. The word interlock, ugly in the mouth, became beautiful in the manual. Rules that had been guidance became mandatory. Because English is a strategic weapon too. Checklists added lines. Lines added signatures. Signatures added responsibility that nobody could hand to someone else if the day went bad. In the labs, engineers revisited the chemistry that lets implausible reactions wait patiently until the moment a switch is thrown. Failsafe grew a spine. Positive control stopped being a slogan and became a ritual, and yet, for all that, the cold fact remained. You cannot burn a thing that dangerous on a sheet of winter and walk away as if it were a bonfire in a field. That was the unphotographable truth that lived in the doctors, graphs, and the veterans, memories, and the fishermen's stories. The men who had worked waist-deep in a season of careful steam carried the knowledge the way one carries a bruise under a sleeve, rarely shown, sometimes forgotten, always real when pressed. Many of them were fine, some were not. The ledger was not simple. It never is, when the entries are people. Years later, a crew passed through Thule on a supply hop and visited the shore where, if you knew the story, you could point and say, "Out there." The sea was a milder color that day. The ice line sat further out, as if the water had decided to take a step back out of courtesy. A young airman, born years after the fire, listened to an older sergeant explain how the grit had been laid, how the melters had breathed, how the barrels had gathered into a confidence only counting can give. The airman nodded with a polite intensity that promised he would remember this better than he remembered most things said during official tours. He asked why it mattered to know all of this. The sergeant thought for a moment, noticed the gulls arguing over nothing, and said, "Because someday you won't get to choose which job shows up. And when that day comes, you'll do the uninteresting thing correctly for as long as it takes." That is how we keep the world from learning a word it shouldn't. In Denmark, anniversaries accumulated. An investigative journalist wrote a book with a cover that showed snow and flame in the same frame, a compositing trick the weather could have done itself. Politicians who had made their names asking for files now had to sign their names to budgets that paid for long-term health monitoring. Activists who had shouted at fences successfully learned the hard bureaucratic work of committees, which is shouting with commas. The country had a conversation with its past and did not pretend it had won the argument entirely. That is how adults behave. In the United States, a retired officer gave a talk at a college about nuclear surety, a phrase so bloodless it feels safe to carry in your pocket. He told the students 3 stories without saying where. One about a bomb that armed itself as it fell and was stopped by 2 pins and luck disciplined by checklist. One about a plane that dropped steel into a Spanish field and taught 2 countries how to share a broom. And one about ice and fire. He did not show photographs. He did not need to. He finished with a sentence that felt like a mirror. Deterrence is not courage. Deterrence is a chore. The students applauded because they had been taught to applaud. A few in the next days thought about the sentence while standing alone in a quiet elevator and felt something heavy rearrange its weight inside them. Artifacts of the fire found homes. A melted bracket, harmless now, labeled with a number that once meant urgency, sat in a box in a museum's basement with a card that read, "Loan, United States Air Force." A set of tongs with burn marks lived in a glass case in a small historical society near a Danish harbor. The chalkboard from the grid hut did not survive, which is how chalkboards say goodbye. The gloves under glass did. A photograph of dog teams merging into the silhouette of a helicopter hung in a hallway known only to people who know the smell of old wool and diesel. Nat Thule itself, the base chapel, held a service years after anyone remembered to call it an anniversary. There was no program. A chaplain read 3 short psalms and then left a long silence after each, as if silence were the guest of honor. A Greenlandic elder spoke about wind as teacher. A Danish officer recited a prayer in a language that sounded like water folded into bread. An American kept his head bowed and his eyes open, because that is how we learn to pray in rooms that are also radios. No one mentioned the fire. Everyone knew the subject. What, in the end, changed? Fewer planes flew with secrets at night. More machines grew the habit of doubting themselves before they obeyed. Manuals learned new verbs. Checklists learned to accept the authority of the person holding them. Countries had hard conversations that made their constitutions feel like living rooms instead of monuments. The ice returned to being ice, which is not nothing. And a small, unheroic sentence became policy in places that keep our luck on a leash. If you don't have to risk it, don't. NIF, you need a closing image. Make it small. A mechanic in coveralls in a hangar at Thule, long after the last crested ice barrel kissed the side of a ship and left the latitude, finishing a day's work by wiping a wrench with a rag. He writes the date on a maintenance card. He lines the numbers up so neatly you'd think they were being inspected. He hangs the wrench in its place, just so. He flips off a light and leaves one on, because one light should always stay on in a room that cares for things that fly. Outside, the wind tests the door and decides, for tonight, to be kind. Or make it this: a row of barrels in a distant storage site, humming because buildings hum, their labels clean, their bolts uninteresting, their existence proof that we are capable not only of making danger but of shepherding it, for years if necessary, into quiet corners and keeping it there with calendars and keys and stubborn, unfancy attention. Nor this: the shore north of Thule on a clear day, the water black and honest, the ice line a careful ruler, two ravens debating across the sky about nothing. A person stands there with a thermos and a memory they cannot hand to anyone else, and pours a little coffee into the snow for a friend they can name and a friend they cannot. The coffee steams, then disappears. The wind lifts the collar of the coat and then puts it back where it belongs. NWE with the ledger. Not the one in a vault, not the one with stamps, the one each person who was there keeps in a private drawer. On the left, a night turned noon, a plane made into objects, a map made into a grid. On the right, barrels, numbers, names, letters, a base that kept doing its job. The balance is not justice. It is something else that we accept when justice cannot operate at 40 below. It is the knowledge that once, a place designed for one kind of vigilance became the capital of another, and the people in it rose to the most difficult occasion of all, the occasion to be competent for weeks. NIF. You listen closely to that ledger, it does not sing. It rustles, paper on paper, glove on barrel, brush on metal, pencil on card. It sounds like work done properly. It sounds like a hum that never needed to learn how to become a scream. And so, Thule on fire, Thule undone, Thule repaired. The sky is again just sky. The dishes turn. The pencils, those humble gods of our better habits, still wait in cups by telephones, red grease and ordinary graphite, ready to draw the square around the square, to circle the hour that will matter later, to sign the name that will not make headlines and will not need to. And somewhere, on an ice edge that doesn't care about dates, under an aurora that writes bright nonsense across the dark, wind moves over sea, and sea answers with the old sound. It is not the sound of danger. It is the sound of a place that gave up a secret long enough for humans to handle it, then took its quiet back. NTHE lesson, if you insist. Build systems that assume mistakes will happen, and people who assume they must not. Trust the person with the meter more than the person with the rank. Make the boring thing easy to do, and the dramatic thing hard. And keep a pencil handy for the day the world asks you, very politely, to be ordinary in extraordinary weather. NTHE light hums. The wrench hangs where it should. The ledger closes without a slam. Far above, the aurora folds itself neatly and goes back into the drawer of the sky. The base waits, as bases do, listening. The ice keeps no grudges. It keeps only footprints for a while, then edits them in its favorite style. If you go there, you won't see the fire. You'll feel the wind touch your face as if to say, you did what you had to, and you did it long enough. And that is why most of us never learn this story as a tragedy. NTHAT is a good final line for a place that knows how to end things.